In the wake of World War II, many politicians, including President Truman, advocated reform of the 1924 Act. Particularly, they wanted to replace national origins quotas with some other measure of worthiness, such as individual skills of value to the country or the preservation of family units. Nativists and restrictionists fought back hard. They wanted to maintain the racial and ethnic quotas that they had so successfully that had so successfully reduced the number of Asian and Southern and Eastern European immigrants allowed into the country. One bill that would mollify those who wished to end quotas but not get rid of them was the one introduced by Senator Pat McCarran of Nevada and Congressman Frank Walter of Pennsylvania. This bill kept national origins quotas in place, but added skill-based preferences within each group. And again, in an effort to mollify critics, the bill proposed a very important change, that the racial requirements for citizenship would be removed. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 passed both houses of Congress, but was vetoed by President Truman. In his speech proclaiming the veto, he said, "Today, we are quote-unquote protecting ourselves as we were in 1924, against being flooded by immigrants from Eastern Europe. This is fantastic. We do not need to be protected against immigrants from these countries. On the contrary, we want to stretch out a helping hand to save those who have managed to flee into Western Europe, to succor those who are brave enough to escape from barbarism, to welcome and restore them against the day when their countries will, as we hope, again be free." These are only a few examples of the absurdity, the cruelty of carrying over into the year 1952 the isolationist limitations of our 1924 law. In no other realm of national life are we so hampered and stultified by the dead hand of the past as we are in this field of immigration. It's clear, though, that there was tremendous support for the maintenance of isolationist and restrictionist policies within Congress, because Truman's veto was overridden by a 3-2 margin in both the House and the Senate. Senator McCarran, speaking on the day that the veto was overridden, said, "I believe that this nation is the last hope of Western civilization, and if this oasis of the world shall be overrun, perverted, contaminated, or destroyed, then the last flickering light of humanity will be extinguished. I take no issue with those who would praise the contributions which have been made to our society by people of many races, of varied creeds and colors. However, we have in the United States today hardcore, indigestible blocks, which have not become integrated into the American way of life, but which, on the contrary, are its deadly enemies. Today, as never before, untold millions are storming our gates for admission, and those gates are cracking under the strain. The solution of the problems of Europe and Asia will not come through a transplanting of those problems en masse to the United States. I do not intend to become prophetic, but if the enemies of this legislation succeed in riddling it to pieces, or in amending it beyond recognition, they will have contributed more to promote this nation's downfall than any other group since we achieved our independence as a nation." While Truman may have lost this particular battle, by the mid-1950s the winds of change were definitely pushing in his direction. At the same time that labor leaders were publicizing the so-called wetback problem, they were also urging an end to national origins requirements as unjust, anti-egalitarian, and undemocratic. Further, the liberal, largely northeastern wing of the Democratic Party began to seek to remove traces of race and ethnicity from immigration policy in the late 1950s. They were, of course, thwarted by a powerful southern bloc of the party, but they at least engendered discussion of immigration reform in Congress. A variety of liberal Democrats from around the country began to embrace the notion that there is strength in diversity and to publish books and give speeches on tolerance and immigration reform. Some examples that you may be aware of are Hubert Humphrey and John F. Kennedy, who penned the book A Nation of Immigrants. Emerging in the context of the broader civil rights movement, there was a rising chorus of voices creating momentum for actual reform, not just minor alterations to the existing system. True change, though, was quite slow in coming because of intense political resistance. Although Kennedy campaigned on the issue of tolerance of ethnic differences and immigration reform, it took him almost 2 years to act when he became president. But the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and shifts in belief in political power were all crucial elements in the ultimate success of immigration reform. At the time of his death, Kennedy was slowly chipping away at the status quo, which by this we mean the effort to end national origins quotas, but nothing happened quickly. Kennedy's major success before his assassination was ending the Bracero program, which was the bane of organized labor, had become rife with corruption, and led to overt abuse of Bracero workers. It also encouraged simultaneous illegal immigration for people who did not qualify for the Bracero program. Legislation to end the Bracero program was passed in 1961, but the program actually only ended in 1963 to give all parties a chance to work out new labor agreements. Growers mounted an intense effort to continue the program, but did not have enough support in Congress to revive it. Proponents of ending the Bracero program failed to predict that the end of a legal channel for immigration would spur an increased use of those illegal channels that had previously existed alongside the Bracero worker program. While liberal immigration reform advocates were heartened by the actions of John F. Kennedy as president, they were thrown into a situation of uncertainty when he was assassinated. When Lyndon Baines Johnson became president, immigration reform advocates weren't sure what to expect. He had supported the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 and was, after all, from Texas. But in reality, he had little choice in the direction of his policy on immigration, given the larger Great Society goals that he had put forward upon becoming president. How could he have squared national origins quotas with civil rights law and the desire to increase the United States' influence in the developing world? Rhetorically, he advocated a meritocratic immigration policy that asked, "What can you do for our country?" not "In what country were you born?" As Lyndon Baines Johnson was laying out his Great Society plan, a plan to abolish national quotas had been drawn up by the Kennedy administration was introduced into the House by Representative Emanuel Seller from New York, with co-sponsorship of Senator Philip Hart. Just as President Johnson was articulating his Great Society plan, a bill to abolish national quotas that had been drawn up by the Kennedy administration was introduced into the House of Representatives by Representative Emanuel Seller. It was co-sponsored in the Senate by Philip Hart of Michigan. President Johnson sent a special message to Congress asking them to pass this bill swiftly. Ultimately, this bill was passed and became the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The most important dimension of this act was that it abolished the national origins quota system, which had become an international embarrassment. It was replaced with a preference system that focused on specific skills seen to be valuable to the nation, as well as existing family relationships with citizens or legal residents of the United States. The details of the plan, of the act, were that 170,000 visas would be created for immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, with no country being allotted more than 20,000 visas. 120,000 visas were reserved for the Western Hemisphere, with no country limits imposed. This led to a total of 290,000 visas. Additional visas could be offered without affecting the quota to spouses, unmarried minor children, and parents of U.S. citizens. As I just mentioned, the 1965 Act replaced the national origins quotas with a preference system that gave primacy to family links and also professions that were considered useful or in demand in the United States. We can see in this chart that there was a preference for unmarried adult children of U.S. citizens then spouses, then members of exceptional professions, which were generally engineering, medicine, and a few others. Then, fourth, we see that married children of citizens. Fifth, brothers and sisters. Sixth, skilled and unskilled workers who fill labor shortages. And finally, refugees. It's important to note that the refugee issue was not solved by this particular system. Over time, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, when crises occurred, executive orders or exceptions were made to allow many more refugees into the country than the 17,400 allotted under this preference system. The final thing that I want to note, and you can see that at the bottom, is that the idea behind this act was that nearly 3/4 of the people admitted into the country would have family here. There would be family links, and 20% would be employment-based. Thus, the 1965 Act ended the national origins system in a way that appeased critics by limiting overall numbers of immigrants and giving preference to skilled workers and people with family connections. Because of this preference for family connections with citizens and legal residents, supporters and even some critics argued that Western and Northern Europeans would still benefit more than Asian, Latin American, and Southern and Eastern European people. However, and ironically, the 1965 Act actually opened the door to Asian, African, Caribbean, and Latin American immigration, as pressures that led immigration in Europe eased significantly, particularly with the rise of the European welfare state after World War II. Chain migration of non-European immigrants with family preferences was also something that became a trend after 1965. I would like to end the second part of this lecture with 3 discussion questions listed here. First, how did the 1965 Act make it easier for Asian and African immigrants to come to the United States? Second, explain chain migration. And third, describe the strengths and limitations of the 1965 Act. Just to give you a quick preview, in the next lecture, we are going to talk about how the 1965 Act played out and what the implications were for this massive change in the demographics of immigrants coming into the United States, both positively and in terms of resistance to these changes.